In a fishing town in Fukuoka Prefecture called Hisayama, researchers have been checking the brains of every resident over 65 for more than 50 years straight. Same families, same doctors, same autopsy protocol when someone passes, so a suspected diagnosis can be confirmed rather than guessed. It's one of the longest running dementia studies on Earth, and the finding that keeps surfacing survey after survey has nothing to do with pills. You've probably seen the ads in Ginkgo biloba, Prevagen. Some powder with a Latin name and a jellyfish on the label. None of them show up in the Hisayama data. What shows up instead is a stack of ordinary habits so unglamorous that most health channels skip past them to get to the supplement pitch. Today, we're not skipping past them. Start with what's actually on the plate. The Hisayama researchers tracked a dietary pattern heavy in vegetables, fruit, soybean products like tofu and natto, seaweed, and fish, and light on white rice. People eating that way had a measurably lower risk of developing dementia over the follow-up period than people eating a more westernized diet. A newer nationwide study pulling data from almost 9,000 adults over 65 found a Japanese-style diet built around protein and minerals cut the odds of all-cause dementia roughly in half compared to the lowest adherence group. Portion size matters too. Okinawan elders have long practiced hara hachibu, stopping a meal at roughly 80% full instead of finishing the plate, a habit tied in population studies to lower rates of the obesity and metabolic dysfunction that drag on blood vessels feeding the brain. But a diet on its own doesn't explain why a grandmother in Hisayama scores sharper on memory tests at 78 than an office worker half her age back home eating fast food. So the researchers kept digging, and the second piece of the puzzle wasn't food, it was feet. Across dozens of Japanese municipalities, a survey of over 83,000 people aged 65 and up found something the health industry rarely talks about: neighborhood grocery stores. Not gyms, grocery stores. Elderly residents who live close enough to walk to a food market and who did so 3 or 4 times a week showed a lower rate of cognitive decline than residents who drove or had groceries delivered. It wasn't the shopping, it was the walk there and back, done on a schedule, week after week for decades. Movement built into the errand instead of schedule as a workout you can skip. Therefore, the picture starts to shift. This isn't a biohack, it's an environment that makes a healthy choice the boring default choice. And that environment runs on something the West doesn't really have a word for. The Japanese call it ikigai, roughly a reason to get up in the morning. Researchers studying dementia prevention in Japan have found that people who report having a strong sense of ikigai, whether that's tending a garden, running a small shop, or looking after grandchildren, show better outcome on cognitive and rehabilitation measures than people who describe their days as purposeless. It sounds soft? It isn't. A reason to leave the house is also a reason to walk to the store, talk to a neighbor, and keep the brain doing the kind of complex, socially demanding work that a crossword puzzle can't replicate. Here's where it gets specific. Visit a senior center in rural Japan and you won't find people staring at brain training apps. You'll find calligraphy classes where an 80-year-old is controlling a brush with a level of fine motor precision most 20-year-olds have never attempted. You'll find Go and Shogi boards, Japan's version of chess, play out loud in tea houses by men who have been rivals for 40 years. You'll find Radio Teiso, the same 3-minute calisthenics routine broadcast every single morning since the 1920s, done in unison in parks before the shops open. None of it is marketed as brain training. All of it functions as brain training because it combines movement, fine motor skill, and social pressure to actually show up. And the food keeps getting stranger the closer you look. A 2025 cohort study out of the JACUS research group followed community-dwelling older adults and found that regular cheese eaters had a lower incidence of dementia than non-cheese eaters, a pattern researchers link to vitamin K2 and the probiotic activity in fermented dairy. It's not a headline food. Nobody's selling you cheese as a nootropic, but it shows up in the data anyway. Sitting quietly next to the fish, the natto, and the green tea that most of these same households drink 2 or 3 times a day, delivering a steady dose of catechins that multiple Japanese cohort studies have tied to slower cognitive decline. Then there's the number nobody puts on a supplement label because it isn't sexy: blood pressure. The Hisayama researchers have been tracking it for decades, and midlife hypertension keeps turning up as one of the strongest predictors of vascular dementia later in life, the kind caused by damaged blood vessels starving parts of the brain of oxygen rather than plaque buildup. Japan's own hypertension society now recommends keeping systolic pressure under 130 starting in your 50s, not your 70s, because the damage that shows up on a brain scan at 80 was often written decades earlier, and it's not just the average number that matters. A Hisayama analysis found that people whose blood pressure swung up and down the most from day to day, even with a normal average, had a meaningfully higher rate of dementia than people whose numbers stay steady. Stability, not just a good number on one visit, was the protective factor. Diabetes tells a similar story from a different organ. Hisayama data going back decades found that people with diabetes had roughly double the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease compared to people with normal blood sugar. And the mechanism isn't a mystery. Insulin resistance in the body tends to show up as insulin resistance in the brain, disrupting how neurons clear waste and starving them of usable fuel. Therefore, a diet built around fish, vegetables, and soybeans instead of white rice and sugar isn't just a heart-healthy choice. In Hisayama's own numbers, it's a blood sugar choice with a brain attached to it. But there's a stranger, more physical marker in the same data set, and it has nothing to do with diet at all. It's grip strength. Researchers tracking those same residents over time found that people whose hand grip weakened significantly from midlife to late life had roughly a 50% higher risk of developing dementia than people whose grip stayed steady independent of age. Nobody's brain got smaller because their hands got weaker. Grip strength is a proxy for something bigger: general muscle mass, nerve signaling speed, and how much physical activity a body is still doing day to day. A weakening grip is often the earliest visible sign that the whole system, muscles and brain included, has quietly started coasting instead of working. There's a recovery habit hiding in plain sight too, and is easy to mistake for tourism. Onsen bathing, sitting in hot mineral water for 20 or 30 minutes most evenings, and Shinrin Yoku, forest bathing, walking slowly through trees with no destination, both show up in Japanese physiological studies as reliable ways to lower circulating cortisol. Chronically high cortisol doesn't just thicken the waistline, it's been linked in multiple studies to hippocampal shrinkage, and the hippocampus is the part of the brain doing most of the heavy lifting for memory formation. In this context, an evening soak works as a nightly cortisol reset that happens to also feel pleasant, which is probably why it survived as a daily habit instead of falling off like flossing does everywhere else in the world. Go back to that plate for a second, because there's one more layer to it that most nutrition videos flatten into a single word: fermented. Miso, natto, pickled vegetables, and soy sauce aren't just flavor. They're a daily dose of live bacteria feeding the gut. And a growing body of Japanese research into the gut-brain axis has found that the makeup of someone's gut microbiome correlates with markers of cognitive function later in life, likely through inflammation control and the production of short-chain fatty acids that influence the brain indirectly through the vagus nerve. Nobody in Hisayama is eating natto because they read a paper about the vagus nerve. They're eating it because their mother made it and their grandmother made it before that. The mechanism showed up in a lab decades after the habit was already load-bearing. There's also what happens after the lights go off, and Japanese researchers have been unusually blunt about this one. Sleep is when the brain runs its own cleanup crew, flushing out a protein called beta amyloid that built up during waking hours and is one of the physical markers found in Alzheimer's brains at autopsy. Cohort studies out of Japan have linked both short sleep, under 6 hours a night, and unusually long sleep, over 9 or 10 hours, to higher dementia risk, with the lowest risk sitting in a fairly ordinary 6 to 7 hour band. None of that requires a supplement either. It requires going to bed at roughly the same time enough nights in a row that the cleanup crew actually gets its shift in, and then there's the piece that's easiest to overlook because it doesn't look like health advice at all. It looks like gossip. Loneliness researchers working with older Japanese populations have repeatedly found that social isolation, not just living alone but having genuinely thin contact with other people, tracks with faster cognitive decline, independent of diet or exercise. This is where the tea house conversations, the shogi rivalries that have run for 40 years, the neighborhood walk that turns into 10 minutes of talking with the shopkeeper, stop being charming cultural color and start looking like a deliberate defense system. A brain that has to track who said what, remember 3 people's grandchildren's names, and follow an argument about the wrong ending to a rivalry from 1987 is doing harder cognitive work than any app with a mascot on it. Multi-generational households, still common in rural Japan, add another layer on top of that. A grandparent who's needed for childcare, opinions, or simply showing up has a harder time drifting into the kind of quiet isolation that researchers keep flagging as a silent risk factor. So none of this on its own is the answer. That's the part the supplement industry doesn't want you to sit with. There is no single nutrient, no single crossword, no single pill doing the work. What the Hisayama data actually shows across decades and thousands of brain scans is compounding. A 10-minute walk to buy vegetables, a cup of tea with a neighbor, 20 minutes of brush strokes, a game of shogi that runs into its 3rd hour because nobody wants to be the one who loses, a blood pressure number checked at home instead of guessed at, repeated most days for most decades until the habits aren't habits anymore. They're just what the day looks like. And a brain that's been doing that math for 50 years is not the same brain as one that started paying attention at 70. But here's the part that should worry you more than comfort you. Even with all of this, dementia in Japan is not disappearing. It affected an estimated 12% of people over 65 as of 2022, and researchers project that number will keep climbing as the population ages. A recent 37-year trend analysis out of Hisayama itself found the underlying incidence rate climbing even as individual risk factors like hypertension got better managed, a reminder that an aging population can outrun even genuinely good medicine. Younger Japanese generations moving into cities, eating more processed food, walking less, sleeping less, are starting to lose the very environment that protected their grandparents. The protection was never in the culture exactly. It was in the daily architecture built on top of that culture. The walkable grocery store, the tea house, the multi-generational household with a reason to be needed, and architecture can be torn down in a single generation if nobody rebuilds it on purpose, which raises the only question that actually matters once the video ends, not what supplement should I buy? The habits in that dataset, the walk, the tea, the brush, the reason to get up, the number on the blood pressure cuff, none of them require a Japanese zip code or a Japanese grandmother. They require a Tuesday you're willing to protect. So look at your own week honestly. Is there a version of that walk to the market already built into it? Or did you engineer it out years ago without noticing? One delivery app and one parking spot closer to the door at a time. If a brain scan in 50 years is being written by what you repeat this week, what's actually on the page so far, if this kind of research into how other cultures quietly outlive and outthink the rest of us is useful to you, there's more of it waiting in the next video, and it starts with the country that treats forgetting nothing as a design problem, not an accident.